Close your eyes. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting right now. Feel the weight of the day beginning to dissolve. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your mind begin its slow, quiet drift away from everything that happened today, everything waiting for tomorrow. You are safe. You are still. And tonight we are going somewhere very, very far away. Not across an ocean. Not to another continent. We're going back through time itself. Back through layers of stone and silence. Back through extinctions and eruptions and the slow, patient churning of continents. Back through ice ages and fire ages and the long dark quiet between catastrophes. We are going back to a world that existed long before the first human ever drew breath. A world so ancient, so alien, so breathtakingly different from the one you know, that it might as well be another planet entirely, because in a very real sense it was. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Settle in, breathe slowly and let the ancient world come to you. We want to thank you for supporting us by leaving a like and subscribing to help us keep this channel going. Anyways, back to the video. Tonight, we're going to travel through time in a way that no machine could ever manage. We're going to do it quietly, gently, through the slow accumulation of story and detail, and the deep, meditative pleasure of understanding just how extraordinary this planet truly is. By the time we reach the end of this journey, you will have passed through worlds that most people never think about. You will have breathed the air of ancient atmospheres, walked through forests that no longer exist, and watched the slow parade of creatures that came before us, each generation preparing the way for the next, none of them knowing what they were building toward, and all of it, every single moment of this impossibly long story, was necessary. Every extinction, every adaptation, every quiet revolution in the chemistry of the air or the ocean. Without any one of these chapters, we would not be here. You would not exist. I would not exist. None of the human world with all its noise and beauty and complexity would be possible. So let us begin. Let us go back, all the way back to a world before us. 4.5 billion years ago there was no Earth. There was only debris. Picture a vast cloud of gas and dust drifting through the early solar system. A slow, swirling nebula of leftover material from the formation of the sun. There was nothing organized about it. Nothing intentional. Just particles, each one impossibly small, drifting in the cold dark between the stars, and then, very slowly, gravity began to whisper. Particles pulled together, clumps formed, those clumps pulled in more material, collisions happened, each one releasing heat, each one adding mass to the growing body at the center of the cloud. This is how planets are born. Not in an instant, not in a single dramatic event, but in millions of years of quiet, relentless accumulation. The early Earth was nothing like the world you know. It was a molten hell, a sphere of liquid rock glowing orange and red in the darkness of space, bombarded constantly by asteroids and comets from the chaotic young solar system. The surface was not a surface at all, not in any meaningful sense. It was a churning ocean of magma, miles deep, stretching from pole to pole. Heat radiated off it in waves. The young sky above was thick with volcanic gases, hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapor, a toxic shroud that bore no resemblance to the clean blue atmosphere we breathe today. This period is called the Hadean Eon. The name comes from Hades, the Greek underworld. Scientists gave it that name for good reason. There was no life. There could not be life. The planet was too hot, too violent, too chemically chaotic for any molecule complex enough to be called biological to survive for even a moment. But something extraordinary was already happening beneath all that chaos. The Earth was sorting itself out. Because Earth is not a uniform ball of rock. It is layered, like an onion, each layer made of different materials with different densities. In those first hundreds of millions of years, as the planet slowly cooled from the outside in, heavier elements like iron and nickel sank toward the center, drawn down by gravity, pooling at the very core of the world. Lighter materials rose, forming what would eventually become the crust. This process, called differentiation, was one of the most important things that ever happened to our planet. Because that iron core, that dense metallic heart at the center of the Earth, would eventually begin to spin, and a spinning iron core generates a magnetic field, and a magnetic field, extending out into space like an invisible shield, deflects the solar wind that, stream of charged particles constantly blasting outward from the sun. Without that magnetic field, the solar wind would strip away our atmosphere. It would tear away our oceans. It would leave the surface exposed to radiation so intense that complex chemistry, the kind that eventually produced life, would be impossible. So even in the hellish chaos of the Hadean, the foundations of a living world were being laid. The oceans arrived during this period too. For a long time, scientists debated where Earth's water came from. The leading theory today is that it came primarily from asteroids and comets, water-rich bodies from the outer solar system that crashed into the young Earth in enormous numbers during a period called the Late Heavy Bombardment. This was roughly 4 billion years ago, and it was exactly as dramatic as it sounds. The sky over young Earth would have been ablaze almost constantly with incoming projectiles. Some were the size of mountains, a few were the size of small planets. Each impact released enormous heat, vaporizing water, rock, and anything else in the vicinity. But the planet kept accumulating more, and gradually as the bombardment slowed and the surface cooled, water vapor in the atmosphere condensed and fell as rain. The rain fell for millions of years. It filled the low-lying areas of the crust. It became the oceans. Those first oceans were not blue. They were probably a murky brownish-green, filled with dissolved minerals from the rocks they sat upon. The chemistry of that early ocean was nothing like today. The water was more acidic. The temperature was warmer. There was almost no oxygen either dissolved in the water or present in the atmosphere above. But there was chemistry. There was warmth. There were minerals. There were energy sources from lightning, from hydrothermal vents at the ocean floor, from ultraviolet radiation pouring down from the sun through that thin early atmosphere, and somewhere in that murky chemical, soup, in some quiet corner of the young ocean, perhaps near a hydrothermal vent where mineral-rich water seeped up from the rocks below, something happened. The exact moment is lost to us. We may never know precisely where or when it occurred. But at some point, roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, chemistry became biology. A molecule appeared that could do something no other molecule had ever done before. It could copy itself. This is where the story of life begins. Not with a roar, not with a flash of light, not with anything dramatic at all. Just a single molecule, vanishingly small, in the vastness of an ancient ocean, quietly making a copy of itself, and then another, and another. In that replication, in that first imperfect copy of a first imperfect molecule, the entire history of life on Earth was contained as potential. Every creature that has ever lived, every dinosaur, every fern, every whale, every humble bacterium, every human being who ever drew breath, all of us trace our lineage back to that moment. But we were a very long way away yet. For billions of years, life would remain simple, invisible to the naked eye, single-celled, microscopic, locked in the chemistry of the ocean. But even in that simplicity, revolution was coming. It was just taking its time. The Earth was patient. It had nothing but time. Let yourself breathe with that thought for a moment. 4.5 billion years. Life appearing nearly 4 billion years ago. And yet here you are, the latest chapter in a story so long it barely seems real. You're made of ancient things. The iron in your blood was forged in the heart of a star that exploded before our sun was born. The calcium in your bones was built in the nuclear furnace of long-dead stellar giants. The water in your cells has been cycling through the atmosphere and the oceans for billions of years, passing through clouds and rivers and ancient seas, through the bodies of creatures whose names we do not know. You are, in a very real sense, as old as the universe, and that is a thought worth carrying gently into sleep. But we are not done yet. We have barely begun. The story of what came before humans is long and strange and full of wonders. Let us keep going. Let us linger a little longer in that ancient heat. The Hadean Eon lasted from the formation of the Earth, roughly 4.5 billion years ago, until approximately 4 billion years ago. It is the longest single eon in Earth's history, and it is also the one we know least about because the geological record from that period has been almost entirely destroyed. The relentless geological activity of a young, hot planet, the churning of the mantle, the recycling of the crust, the constant bombardment from space, erased most of what the Hadean might have preserved. Almost, but not entirely. In the Jack Hills of Western Australia, geologists have found something extraordinary. Tiny crystals of a mineral called zircon embedded in ancient rocks that date to approximately 4.4 billion years ago. These zircon crystals are the oldest known material of terrestrial origin on Earth. They formed during the Hadean, and they have survived in their original crystalline structure to the present day, despite everything the planet has thrown at them in the intervening 4 billion years. And what these tiny crystals tell us is surprising. The chemistry of ancient zircon crystals contains information about the conditions under which they formed. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes preserved in the crystal lattice indicates that the crystals formed in the presence of liquid water. This suggests that, even in the very earliest period of Earth's history, even in the Hadean heat, liquid water may have been present on or near the surface. This challenges the image of the Hadean as a completely molten, hellish world. The surface may have been hot, certainly. The planet was being bombarded, constantly. But perhaps not everything was molten everywhere all the time. Perhaps there were brief windows between major impacts, when the surface could cool enough to allow liquid water to pool in low-lying areas, even if only temporarily, even if only in small amounts. The implications for life are significant. The earliest life we know about dates to roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. But if liquid water was present even earlier, could life have begun earlier than that? Could life have appeared and been destroyed by subsequent impacts multiple times over? Could the origin of life have been not a unique event, but a repeating experiment that the universe ran over and over until conditions finally stabilized enough for it to persist? These are questions without definitive answers, but they speak to something profound about the nature of this planet and perhaps of life in the universe generally. Life wants to exist. That is perhaps putting it too purposefully, because evolution and chemistry have no purpose in the human sense. But the conditions for life, the chemistry, the energy, the liquid water, have been present on Earth for almost its entire history. And wherever those conditions have existed, on timescales long enough for chemistry to do its patient work, life has appeared. The Hadean also gave our planet its moon. The moon is not a coincidence. It did not always exist. It formed, according to the leading hypothesis, roughly 4.5 billion years ago, shortly after the Earth itself formed, when a body roughly the size of Mars collided with the proto-Earth in a glancing blow. This collision was not a head-on impact, but an oblique strike, the kind that shears off material rather than simply adding mass. The collision vaporized the impacting body and a significant portion of the Earth's outer layers. A vast cloud of debris expanded outward from the collision point, surrounding the Earth in a ring of molten rock and vaporized silicate. Over thousands of years, the debris in this ring coalesced, pulled together by its own gravity, forming the Moon. The early Moon was much closer to the Earth than it is today. At its formation, it may have been only 20 or 30,000 kilometers away, compared to the current average distance of 384,000 kilometers. At that distance, the Moon would have appeared enormous in the sky, perhaps 15 or 20 times larger in apparent diameter than it does today. The tidal forces it exerted on the still cooling Earth would have been extraordinary, raising tides hundreds of meters high in the young oceans, flexing and heating the crust. The Moon's presence has been stabilizing for our planet. The gravitational relationship between the Earth and Moon stabilizes the tilt of Earth's rotational axis, keeping it within a relatively narrow range of variation, roughly 22 to 25 degrees over geological time. This stabilization of the axial tilt means that Earth's climate, though it varies enormously on geological timescales, does not undergo the extreme shifts in seasonality that a planet with an unstable axial tilt would experience. Without the Moon, Earth's axis might wobble wildly over millions of years, causing ice ages and heat ages far more extreme than any we know of. Life might have found a much harder road to complexity under those conditions. The Moon rose from catastrophe, and in rising it made the Earth a more habitable world. The geology of the Hadean also set the stage for one of the most important processes in Earth's long history, plate tectonics. The modern Earth is divided into a dozen or so large plates and numerous smaller ones, each carrying a portion of the crust and floating on the viscous upper mantle below. These plates move, driven by heat escaping from the deep interior at rates of a few centimeters per year. Where they collide, mountains rise. Where they separate, new ocean floor is created. Where one dives beneath another, ocean trenches form and volcanoes erupt above the subducting plate. Plate tectonics is not just geology. It is the Earth's primary carbon regulation system. When oceanic crust is subducted and melted, the carbon dioxide locked in seafloor sediments is released back into the atmosphere through volcanoes. When mountains rise as continents collide, silicate rocks are exposed to weathering, a process that draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and locks it in calcium carbonate minerals that eventually wash into the ocean and settle to the seafloor. This weathering feedback loop, the way the rate of carbon dioxide drawdown from the atmosphere increases as temperatures rise, providing a natural thermostat, has kept Earth's temperature within bounds, suitable for liquid water for almost its entire history. Without plate tectonics, this regulatory system would not function. The planet might have drifted into a permanent hothouse or a permanent snowball unable to self-correct. Life, if it existed at all, would have faced a far more hostile environment. We are not certain when plate tectonics began. The evidence from the earliest parts of the geological record is ambiguous. Some researchers argue for a very early start, perhaps 4 billion years ago. Others suggest the modern style of plate tectonics did not begin until 1 to 2 billion years ago. The truth may lie somewhere in between, with early, less organized forms of crustal recycling gradually evolving into the modern system. But the Hadean set up the conditions for it. The heat engine was running, the mantle was hot and moving, the stage was being set for a geological system of extraordinary elegance and importance. The early Earth was, in all these ways, not simply a prelude to the living world. It was an active participant in creating it. The geology, the chemistry, the physics of those early billions of years shaped the conditions that made life first possible and then persistently viable. You're alive in part because this planet has a large moon, because it has plate tectonics, because it has a magnetic field generated by its spinning iron core, because it is located at just the right distance from a stable, long-lived star, because the early solar system delivered enough water, but not too much, because the chemistry of the early ocean was exactly right for the molecules that became the first life. The universe had to be just so for any of this to happen, and it was. Sleep on that improbability. Let it be a comfort rather than a source of anxiety. You are here. Against all odds, after 4.5 billion years of preparation, you are here. And the world that made you is beautiful, right down to its ancient cooling core. There is a question that has haunted biology since the science first began to think seriously about it. Not where life lives, or how it reproduces, or what it eats, but where it came from. How did non-living chemistry become living biology? How did the universe, which knows only atoms and physics and the blind machinery of chemistry, produce something that knows itself? The question is uncomfortable because we do not have a complete answer. We have hypotheses, we have experiments, we have molecules in laboratories that can do things that seem almost biological, but we do not yet have a complete step-by-step, experimentally verified account of how life first appeared on Earth. What we do have is a deepening understanding of the chemistry involved, and that chemistry is extraordinary. The first key insight came in 1952, when a young graduate student named Stanley Miller, working in the laboratory of Harold Urey at the University of Chicago, set up an experiment that would become one of the most famous in the history of science. Miller filled a glass flask with the gases thought to make up the early Earth's atmosphere: methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. He then ran electrical sparks through the mixture to simulate lightning, and he let it run. After just a week, the water in the flask had turned pink, then reddish-brown. When Miller analysed the mixture, he found something extraordinary. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. They had formed spontaneously from simple inorganic gases under the influence of electrical energy. The Miller-Urey experiment did not prove that life had originated in this way, but it demonstrated something profound. The chemistry of life is not magic. It is not a special property of living systems alone. Given the right starting materials and energy sources, the building blocks of life can form spontaneously from simple inorganic precursors. In the decades since Miller's experiment, scientists have found that the chemistry of life's origins is even richer and more varied than the original experiment suggested. Amino acids, nucleotides, sugars, lipids, all can form under conditions that likely existed on the early Earth. They have been found in meteorites, formed in the cold vacuum of interstellar space from simple molecules. They are everywhere. The harder question is not how the building blocks formed, It is how those building blocks were organized into the specific, functional, self-replicating structures that constitute even the simplest form of life. The current leading hypothesis involves RNA. Before DNA and proteins, before the complex biochemistry of modern cells, RNA may have been both the genetic material and the catalytic machinery of the first life. RNA can store information, like DNA. RNA can also catalyze chemical reactions, like proteins. RNA molecules, called ribosomes, have been found in modern cells, performing enzymatic functions, a remnant of this ancient RNA world. In hydrothermal systems on the early ocean floor, the mineral surfaces of the rocks provided scaffolding on which RNA molecules could assemble, concentrate, and begin to replicate. Warm, mineral-rich water cycling through cracks in the seafloor provided energy and raw materials. The confined geometry of those mineral pores created microenvironments where concentrations could build up and reactions could proceed that would be too dilute in open water. The first self-replicating RNA molecules were not life in any complete sense. They could not build their own membranes. They could not control their own chemistry. They were just molecules that copied themselves, imperfectly, with the copies sometimes slightly different from the originals. But that imperfect copying, those small differences between parent and offspring, is evolution. That is all evolution requires. Given time, and the early Earth had enormous amounts of time, some variants copied themselves better than others, more efficiently, more accurately, with less damage from the environment. Those variants became more common, their descendants diversified and competed, and gradually, over hundreds of millions of years of molecular evolution, the simple self-replicating RNA evolved into the much more complex, much more integrated biochemical systems we recognize in modern cells. The membrane came, perhaps from fatty acids that spontaneously formed spherical vesicles in water, enclosing volumes of liquid that could contain the replicating chemistry, perhaps from mineral surfaces that provided boundaries, perhaps in ways we have not yet imagined. The proteins came, RNA molecules that catalyzed the formation of amino acid chains, which then formed structures that were better at catalysis than the RNA itself, a partnership between RNA and protein that gradually became the cell's biochemical machinery. The DNA came, a more stable information storage molecule than RNA, one that could be copied more accurately, preserve genetic information through more generations. The RNA became the intermediary, the messenger between the DNA archive and the protein-making machinery, and at some point, perhaps 4 billion years ago, the chemistry crossed a threshold. It became cellular. It became integrated enough that we would recognize it as life. The origin of life is not a mystery in the sense of being beyond explanation. It is a scientific problem that is actively being worked on and progressively better understood. But it is deeply humbling in its complexity, its improbability from any human perspective, and its profound implications. Life happened here. It may have happened elsewhere in the universe on planets we will never visit. It happened once, or perhaps multiple times, from chemistry that is increasingly well understood. And from that beginning, everything we have talked about tonight followed. 4 billion years of evolution, of diversification, of extinction and recovery, of building and rebuilding the world. From a few molecules in an ancient hot spring to a species that studies its own origins, that is the most extraordinary story ever told, and it is not fiction. For most of Earth's history, life was invisible. This is one of the hardest things to truly grasp about our planet's past. When we think of ancient life, we tend to think of dinosaurs, or at the very least of things large enough to see, to touch, to wonder at. But the dinosaurs represent only the most recent fraction of life's story. For the vast majority of Earth's 4.5 billion years, life was microscopic, single-celled, silent. And yet it was accomplishing something more profound than any creature that came after. It was rebuilding the world. The earliest life forms were prokaryotes, cells without a nucleus, without the complex internal machinery we associate with modern cells. They were simple by almost any measure, but they were alive, and that made all the difference. These early organisms lived in the ocean, extracting energy from chemical reactions in the water around them. Some consumed hydrogen sulfide, a gas that seeped up from hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. Others metabolized iron compounds dissolved in the ancient seawater. They did not need sunlight. They did not need oxygen. In fact, Oxygen would have been toxic to most of them. This world, the world of early life, was profoundly alien. The sky above was a hazy orange, filtered through an atmosphere rich in methane and carbon dioxide. The sun, younger and dimmer than today, hung lower and cooler in that thick sky. There were no clouds as we know them, or at least very different ones. The oceans glittered under that strange light, their surface largely undisturbed by wind because there was nothing on land to generate the temperature differentials that drive modern weather patterns. The land was bare, completely bare. No plants, no animals, not even any complex structures of any kind, just rock. Ancient, raw, exposed rock, slowly being weathered by rain and wind, slowly crumbling into the first primitive soils. For hundreds of millions of years, this was the state of things. Life existed, but you would never know it to look at the planet from above. Life existed only in the ocean, and only at the microscopic scale. And then, sometime around 3.5 billion years ago, a group of microorganisms developed a new trick, a revolutionary trick, a trick that would, over the course of the next 2.5 billion years, completely transform the planet. They learned to eat sunlight, photosynthesis, the capture of solar energy and its conversion into chemical energy, with oxygen released as a byproduct. We take this process so completely for granted today, because it is the foundation of nearly all life on Earth, that we rarely stop to think about how radical an innovation it actually was. Before photosynthesis, life was limited by the availability of chemical energy sources at the ocean floor. Hydrothermal vents were productive, but they were localized. The deep sea was rich with energy in some places and barren in others. Life could not spread far from those energy sources. But sunlight falls everywhere on the ocean surface, everywhere on the planet simultaneously. Once life found a way to tap that source of energy, the entire sunlit surface of the global ocean became available as habitat. The explosion of photosynthetic microorganisms over the next several 100 million years was, in biological terms, enormous. These early photosynthesizers were cyanobacteria. They are still with us today, virtually unchanged from their ancient ancestors, living in every ocean, every lake, every puddle, every damp surface on Earth. They are among the most successful organisms in the history of the planet, and they were quietly, slowly, irrevocably poisoning the atmosphere. From our perspective, oxygen is life. We breathe it. We need it. Without it, we die within minutes. But remember, the early atmosphere had almost no free oxygen in it. The primitive life forms of the Archean era had evolved in an oxygen-free world. To them, oxygen was not life. It was death. As cyanobacteria pumped oxygen into the atmosphere through their photosynthesis, they were committing what biologists call the Great Oxidation Event, sometimes also called the oxygen catastrophe. It happened roughly 2.5 billion years ago, though the oxygen buildup was gradual, taking hundreds of millions of years to reach levels that would begin to affect the chemistry of the ocean and the atmosphere significantly. For the organisms that could not tolerate oxygen, it was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. They retreated to places where oxygen could not reach, to deep ocean sediments, to mud at the bottom of lakes, to the interior of organic matter. Many lineages simply went extinct. But for some organisms, oxygen was opportunity. Aerobic metabolism, the burning of organic compounds with oxygen to produce energy, is far more efficient than anaerobic metabolism. It extracts roughly 18 times more energy from the same amount of food. Organisms that could harness oxygen had an enormous energetic advantage over those that could not. Over the next billion years or so, in an event so slow and gradual that it defies the human ability to visualize, life underwent a fundamental transformation. Cells developed the ability to use oxygen, and then something even more radical happened. Cells began to eat each other, and instead of digesting what they ate, they formed partnerships. This process, called endosymbiosis, is how complex cells, cells with nuclei, cells with mitochondria and chloroplasts, first appeared. A large cell engulfed a smaller cell. The smaller cell, instead of being digested, began to live inside the larger one. Over time, through millions of years of coevolution, the two became one. The smaller cell became the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the modern cell, still recognizable today by its double membrane and its own separate DNA, remnants of its ancient independent existence. Later, some lineages of these complex cells engulfed cyanobacteria and formed a similar partnership. Those internalized cyanobacteria became chloroplasts, the photosynthetic machinery of plant cells. Every plant that has ever grown, every blade of grass, every ancient tree, every seaweed in the ocean, carries within its cells the descendants of ancient cyanobacteria captured in a partnership that began over 1 billion years ago. These complex cells, called eukaryotes, were a revolution. With their internal complexity, their ability to store and access far more genetic information, their metabolic versatility, they were capable of things that prokaryotes could not achieve. But for another 500 million years or so, even eukaryotes remained mostly single-celled. The Earth was already over 3 billion years old before anything with more than one cell appeared. And then, somewhere around 600 to 800 million years ago, in the cold depths of a world that was itself going through dramatic changes, something clicked. Cells began to stay together after dividing. Not as colonies, not as loose aggregations, but as coordinated units where different cells began to specialize, to perform different functions, to communicate with each other through chemical signals. The first multicellular organisms appeared. They were soft, they were small, they left almost no trace in the fossil record, but they were the beginning of everything we recognize as complex life. The beginning of animals, of plants, of fungi, of the whole sprawling diversity of visible life that followed. The world before multicellular life is almost inconceivable in its simplicity and its strangeness, and yet it was not empty, it was teeming. 4 billion years of microbial life had transformed the chemistry of the ocean, the composition of the atmosphere, the nature of the rock itself. The world that multicellular life was born into was a product of all those billions of years of invisible, quiet, revolutionary activity. You breathe today because microorganisms produce the oxygen in the air, the nitrogen in your DNA, in the proteins of your cells, in the food you eat, has been cycled through the global nitrogen cycle, driven in large part by bacteria, for hundreds of millions of years. The carbon in your body has passed through the atmosphere, through the ocean, through the bodies of ancient organisms countless times before it found its way into you. The invisible world made the visible world possible, and now, at last, the visible world was about to begin. Breathe slowly, feel the ground beneath you, feel the solidity of the world. That rock, that soil, those ancient foundations were billions of years in the making before a single animal ever walked upon them. We are getting closer to the familiar now, but the journey is still long and the wonders ahead are extraordinary. There is a billion-year stretch of Earth's history that geologists sometimes call the boring billion. This label is, from a human perspective, somewhat understandable. Roughly from 1.8 to 800 million years ago, the fossil record is sparse, the pace of evolutionary change seems slow, and the big dramatic events that punctuate the earlier and later record are largely absent. But boring is not the same as unimportant. The Proterozoic eon, which spans roughly 2.5 billion years, from the end of the Archean to the beginning of the Cambrian, was a period of preparation, of quiet, patient molecular revolution, of the slow accumulation of innovations that would eventually make the Cambrian explosion possible. It was also the period of snowball Earth, between roughly 700 and 600 million years ago, in the Cryogenian period. The Earth experienced a series of extreme glaciations, unlike anything in its more recent history. Ice sheets extended to or near the equator. The oceans may have frozen over entirely or nearly, so global average temperatures may have dropped to minus 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. This is snowball Earth. How could such an extreme glaciation occur? The trigger was probably the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia, which began about 850 million years ago. As the continent broke apart, the exposed edges of new coastlines were subjected to chemical weathering. This weathering drew down atmospheric carbon dioxide, reducing the greenhouse effect, cooling the planet. As the planet cooled, ice sheets expanded, and here is the key. Ice is white. It reflects sunlight back into space rather than absorbing it, as dark rock or ocean would. The more ice, the more sunlight reflected, the more cooling, the more ice. A runaway feedback loop. Once the glaciation reached a certain extent, perhaps covering about 30% of Earth's surface, the feedback loop became self-reinforcing and nearly unstoppable. The planet plunged into deep freeze. What broke the freeze? Volcanoes. Even under the ice, even in the frozen ocean, the geological processes of the interior continued. Volcanoes continued to erupt. But now, the normal carbon cycle feedback loop that would draw excess carbon dioxide back down was broken, because the ice covered the rocks that would normally weather and absorb the gas. Carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere year after year, millennium after millennium. Eventually, after perhaps millions of years of extreme glaciation, the greenhouse effect overwhelmed the ice albedo feedback. The ice began to melt, and when it began to melt, the melt was as rapid and catastrophic as the freezing had been. The aftermath was a world of extreme chemical disequilibrium. Enormous quantities of nutrients that had been locked under the ice for millions of years flooded into the ocean. The photosynthetic life that had survived in refuges under the ice or near hydrothermal vents exploded in productivity. Oxygen levels, which had been declining during the glaciation as photosynthesis slowed, now spiked. Some researchers believe that the aftermath of Snowball Earth was one of the key triggers for the evolution of complex multicellular life. The nutrient-rich post-glacial oceans, the elevated oxygen levels, the newly opened ecological opportunities, all may have contributed to the conditions that made the Ediacaran fauna and then the Cambrian explosion possible. Life was not merely a passenger on Snowball Earth. It survived, it changed, and in changing it helped reshape the conditions of the planet. The Ediacaran period, roughly 635 to 541 million years ago, takes its name from the Ediacara Hills of South Australia, where some of the most spectacular fossils of this period were first discovered in the 20th century. But Ediacaran fossils have since been found on every continent, from Newfoundland to Namibia to Siberia. The Ediacaran organisms are strange, beautifully, bafflingly strange. Dickinsonia, an oval ribbed creature that lay on the seafloor, perhaps absorbing nutrients through its lower surface. Its largest individuals reached over a metre in length. For decades, paleontologists argued about what it was. Was it an animal? A fungus? Something completely outside the modern categories of life? Recent research has identified cholesterol in preserved Dickinsonia specimens, which strongly suggests it was an animal, but a very unusual one with no clear modern relatives. Charnia, a frond-like organism attached to the seafloor by a holdfast, its body branching repeatedly in a fractal pattern. It looks like a leaf or a fern, but it was something else entirely. It may have been related to modern sea pens, though this is debated. Sprigina, a small creature with a distinct head-like structure and a segmented body, possibly one of the earliest animals to show clear bilateral symmetry and a defined front and back end. Some researchers see in Sprigina the ancestor of the arthropods. Others see something completely different. These creatures lived in shallow marine environments, in what were probably warm, oxygenated waters near the continental shelves. They grazed on microbial mats, or they absorbed nutrients directly from the water, or perhaps they did something else entirely that we have not yet identified. What they did not do, as far as we can tell, was hunt. The Ediacaran world had no predators. There were no animals with claws or teeth or stinging cells, no creatures pursuing other creatures through the water, no chase, no escape, no predator-prey arms race. This was a world of radical peace, or perhaps radical strangeness from our perspective, because we are so accustomed to a world defined by the tension between predator and prey, between hunter and hunted, that a world without that dynamic is almost impossible for us to imagine. Whether the Ediacaran organisms were truly animals truly related to later life, or whether they represent a failed evolutionary experiment entirely unconnected to the Cambrian fauna, is still debated. Some researchers argue that most Ediacaran organisms went completely extinct before the Cambrian began, and that the Cambrian explosion represents a completely fresh start in animal evolution. Others see continuity, see the roots of Cambrian animal groups in the complex Ediacaran forms. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Some Ediacaran organisms or their close relatives may have given rise to Cambrian animal groups. Others may have left no descendants at all, evolutionary experiments that ran their course and ended. But they were here. They were alive. They were the world before the world we recognize, and they matter. In the deep quiet of the late Proterozoic, life was preparing itself for something extraordinary. The molecular machinery of complex cells was being refined. The genetics of multicellularity was being worked out generation by generation, mutation by mutation. The biochemical tools for building complex bodies, nervous systems, sense organs, locomotory apparatus were being assembled from simpler precursors. The Cambrian explosion did not come from nowhere. It was the culmination of 600 million years of molecular preparation. The sudden appearance of animal diversity in the fossil record was not a miracle or a mystery, though it looks like one from a human perspective. It was the final assembly, the putting together of long-prepared parts into integrated wholes. Life was ready. It just needed one more nudge, and when it got that nudge, whatever it was, the ocean filled with life in a geological eye blink. This is how the biggest things often work. Years, decades, centuries of preparation, invisible accumulation, quiet work in the background. And then suddenly a threshold crossed, a cascade, an explosion of consequence. You know something about that lying here at the end of your day, the slow accumulation of a life. The quiet work that goes on beneath the surface, and sometimes unexpectedly something shifts and everything you have been building suddenly becomes visible, becomes real. The ocean knows that feeling. The earth knows it. Life knows it. Rest in that knowledge. We have talked about the great oxygenation event in broad strokes, but the story deserves more attention because it was genuinely one of the most transformative events in the history of the planet. 2.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere contained perhaps 1 part per million of free oxygen. Today, it contains approximately 210,000 parts per million, 21%. That change from essentially 0 to 21% is what the Great Oxygenation Event achieved, and it did not happen overnight. The cyanobacteria that drove this change began their work roughly 3.5 billion years ago, perhaps earlier. But for the first billion years or so, the oxygen they produced was largely absorbed by chemical reactions with iron and other reduced minerals in the ocean and on land. The seafloor sediments of this period are rich in iron minerals called banded iron formations, alternating layers of iron-rich and iron-poor rock that record the slow accumulation of oxidized iron as oxygen from cyanobacterial photosynthesis reacted with dissolved iron in the ancient seawater. Only when the oceanic iron sink was largely saturated could free oxygen begin to accumulate in the atmosphere. The beginning of this accumulation, the Great Oxygenation Event proper, occurred roughly 2.5 billion years ago. The banded iron formations ceased to form at this point, their end marking the transition to an oxidizing ocean. The red beds of ancient soils began to appear, rocks stained red by iron oxides that could only form in the presence of atmospheric oxygen. The geological record changed in dozens of ways, all pointing to the same transformation. And on the life that existed at the time, the effects were catastrophic. The anaerobic microorganisms that had dominated the planet for 2 billion years were poisoned by the rising oxygen. Many lineages went extinct. The survivors retreated to anoxic refuges, the deep ocean mud, the intestines of other organisms, the deep sediments of swamps and bogs. They are still there today. Every time you smell the distinctive rotten egg odor of stagnant water, you are smelling hydrogen sulfide produced by anaerobic bacteria in oxygen-free mud, carrying on the chemistry of the Archean world in microscopic pockets of the modern one. The great irony is that the organisms most damaged by the Great Oxygenation Event had been the dominant life forms on Earth for 2 billion years. The cyanobacteria that drove the change were, in a sense, committing the first mass extinction in Earth's history. But from catastrophe, as always, came opportunity. The aerobic metabolism that oxygen made possible was, as we noted, far more energetically efficient than anaerobic metabolism. Organisms that could harness oxygen could extract up to 18 times more energy from the same amount of food. This energetic windfall was the foundation on which the complexity of eukaryotic cells and eventually of multicellular organisms was built. There is another consequence of atmospheric oxygen that is easy to overlook: the ozone layer. Ozone, O3, forms in the upper atmosphere when ultraviolet radiation from the sun strikes molecular oxygen. O2, breaking it apart, and some of the oxygen atoms recombine in threes. The ozone that forms is an excellent absorber of ultraviolet radiation. Without the ozone layer, the intensity of UV radiation reaching Earth's surface would be lethal to most complex life. Before the Great Oxygenation Event, there was no ozone layer. The surface of the land and the shallow ocean was bathed in ultraviolet radiation at intensities that would cause DNA, damage within minutes in most modern organisms. Life was confined, at least in its most complex forms, to depths in the ocean where the water filtered the UV. The ozone layer that formed as a consequence of the Great Oxygenation Event was what eventually made the colonization of land possible. Not immediately, not for hundreds of millions of years, but the oxygen had to be there first before the ozone could protect the surface. You're breathing the legacy of ancient cyanobacteria. The air that fills your lungs tonight is, in a very real sense, their gift. A gift given 2.5 billion years ago to a world that could not have imagined you, by organisms that could not have known what they were building. The universe does not plan, but the results of its unplanned processes are no less extraordinary for that. 541 million years ago, in a geological instant so brief it barely registers on the scale of Earth's history, the ocean burst into life. This event, the Cambrian explosion, is one of the most debated and most studied chapters in the entire history of life. In a span of perhaps 20 to 25 million years, which sounds long until you realize the planet had already been waiting for complex life for over 3 billion years, virtually every major body plan of animal life that would ever exist appeared in the fossil record for the first time, not evolved gradually from simpler forms, not appearing one by one over hundreds of millions of years. All at once, in a rush, an explosion of biological creativity so rapid and so comprehensive that scientists are still arguing about what caused it. Before the Cambrian, the fossil record is largely empty of complex animal life. After it, the oceans are full. What triggered it? The honest answer is that we are not entirely certain. Several factors probably contributed. The chemistry of the ocean had been changing for millions of years before the Cambrian began. Oxygen levels in the water had been rising. Calcium carbonate, the mineral used to make shells and skeletons, had become more available. The planet had recently emerged from one of the most extreme climate events in its history, a period called Snowball Earth, when glaciers covered the planet from pole to pole and the oceans froze over almost completely. When the ice finally melted, enormous quantities of nutrients flooded into the ocean, potentially fueling a biological explosion. And there may have been an evolutionary trigger too. The development of eyes. Before the Cambrian, most organisms had no sensory apparatus capable of detecting light. But if one organism in an ocean full of soft-bodied, slow-moving creatures suddenly develops the ability to see, the entire dynamic of that ecosystem changes instantly. Predators can now target prey. Prey must now develop defenses. And an arms race begins, driving rapid evolution in all directions. The fossil record of the Cambrian is extraordinary. The best preserved comes from places like the Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada, and the Chengjiang Formation in Yunnan Province, China, where fine-grained sediments preserved soft-bodied creatures in exquisite detail. What those fossils reveal is a world of almost surreal biological diversity. A Nomalocaris, a predator that was enormous by the standards of its day, perhaps 0.5 meter long, drifting through the water column with 2 long, segmented, grasping appendages at the front of its head and a circular, tooth-rimmed mouth. It was probably the apex predator of the Cambrian Ocean, hunting trilobites and whatever else it could catch. Hallucigenia. A creature so strange that when scientists first described it, they could not even determine which end was the front. It walked on paired spines along its underside, with tentacles rising from its back, and appears to have been related to modern velvet worms. Its name says everything about how bewildering it was. Opabinia. 5. Eyes on the top of its head and a long flexible nozzle in front lined with claws. Nothing like it exists today. Nothing like it has existed since the Cambrian. Wiwaxia, a flattened, slug-like creature covered in overlapping scales and sharp spines, feeding on organic matter on the seafloor. And among all these alien forms, something more familiar. A small, eel-like creature called Pikaia, about 5 centimeters long, swimming through the Cambrian Ocean, with a primitive notochord running down its back, a flexible rod that served as a precursor to the vertebral column. Pikaia may be one of the earliest known members of our own phylum Chordata, the phylum that would eventually give rise to fish, and to amphibians, and to reptiles, and to dinosaurs, and to mammals, and to you. In the Cambrian Ocean, our most distant vertebrate ancestors were 5 centimeter swimming worms, and that is both humbling and magnificent. The Cambrian lasted roughly 55 million years. By its end, The oceans were dominated by trilobites, those elegant segmented arthropods with their compound eyes and their armoured carapaces. Trilobites were the most successful marine organisms of the Paleozoic era. They would survive for the next 270 million years, longer than any lineage of dinosaurs, longer than any mammal, in an almost incomprehensible dynasty of diversity and adaptation. But the Cambrian itself is just the beginning of the Paleozoic era, and the Paleozoic is one of the most eventful periods in the history of life on Earth. After the Cambrian came the Ordovician, roughly 485 million years ago. The oceans of the Ordovician were warm and shallow, covering much of the continental masses in a great global marine transgression. Marine ecosystems became extraordinarily complex. Coral reefs appeared for the first time, built not by the corals we know today, but by ancient relatives called tabulate and rugose corals, alongside structures built by sponge-like organisms called stromatoporoids. The Ordovician oceans were a paradise for marine invertebrates, brachiopods, clams with two shells, but an entirely different internal anatomy from modern bivalves, covered the seafloor in dense beds. Cephalopods, relatives of modern squid and nautilus but often with long, straight conical shells, were apex predators of the water column. Sea scorpions, the eurypterids, some of them several meters long, crawled through the shallows hunting whatever they could overpower. And then, at the end of the Ordovician, roughly 445 million years ago, disaster struck. The first of what would become 5 great mass extinctions of the Paleozoic era. The late Ordovician mass extinction killed roughly 85% of all marine species. The cause was a massive glaciation, probably triggered by the movement of the supercontinent Gondwana over the South Pole, which drew down atmospheric carbon dioxide and plunged global temperatures into an ice age. Sea levels dropped as water was locked up in glaciers. The warm, shallow seas that had nurtured such extraordinary diversity drained away. Entire ecosystems collapsed, and yet life survived. It always does. After the extinction, recovery. New species filling the niches left empty by the dead. New ecosystems assembling from the survivors. And then, gradually, something happened that would change the world more profoundly than any extinction. Life came ashore. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was one of the slowest conquests in the history of the planet. But beginning roughly 470 million years ago, during the Ordovician, the first complex organisms began to colonize the land. They were not animals, not yet. They were plants, or more precisely, the ancestors of plants, simple non-vascular organisms related to modern liverworts and mosses. They crept out onto damp rock near the water's edge, tolerating the exposure to direct sunlight and the drying effects of wind that the ocean had always sheltered them from. They were pioneers in the most literal sense, entering a world completely unprepared for them, a world of bare rock and sterile dust that had never felt the weight of a leaf. But they carried with them the tools to transform that world. They could photosynthesize. They could begin to break down rock into the first primitive soils. They could trap moisture. They could create in their tiny incremental way the conditions that would allow more complex life to follow. The land was waiting. It just needed a little help to become a home. Let your breathing slow a little more. We are moving through deep time here, each million years a single quiet breath in the long respiration of the planet. Let the weight of it settle over you like a blanket. We are still a long way from humans, but we are closer now than we were, and the world is becoming slowly, recognizably alive. The Paleozoic era from roughly 541 to 252 million years ago was the great age of marine invertebrates. For most of this vast stretch of time, the most complex and diverse life on Earth lived in the ocean, not on land. And the oceans of the Paleozoic were in some ways richer and stranger than anything alive today. Let us spend some time in those ancient seas. The Ordovician period, 485 to 444 million years ago, was perhaps the peak of Paleozoic marine diversity. The shallow continental seas that covered much of Laurentia, what is now North America, and Gondwana were warm, clear, and extraordinarily productive. Reef systems of impressive scale were built by tabulate and rugose corals alongside the sponge-like archaeocyaths. These reefs provided three-dimensional habitat, their complex surfaces supporting hundreds of species of invertebrates. Brachiopods, the lampshells, were perhaps the most abundant group, covering the seafloor in dense beds. Unlike modern bivalves, to which they are superficially similar, Brachiopods have a completely different internal anatomy and evolutionary history. They were in the Ordovician what mussels and clams are today: filter feeders, harvesting organic particles from the water, providing food for the predators above them in the food chain. Cephalopods were the dominant large predators of Ordovician seas. Not the squid and octopus we know today, but their ancient relatives. Orthocones, like the famous Camaraceras, had long, straight conical shells that could reach several meters in length. They cruised through the water column using jet propulsion, their chambers filled with gas for buoyancy, their eyes large and acute, their tentacles extended to seize prey. The first vertebrates were already present in the Ordovician. Small jawless fish covered in bony armour, feeding in the soft-bottom sediments of shallow seas, they look unlike any modern fish. No jaws, no paired fins, just a torpedo-shaped body with a mouth like a circular sucker at the front. The same basic plan as modern lampreys, but usually more heavily armoured. They are called ostracoderms, and they were the first successful lineage of vertebrates in the ocean. The great diversification of fish came in the Devonian, roughly 419 to 359 million years ago. This is when all the major groups of fish that still exist today, plus many more that do not, first appeared and diversified. The agnathons, the jawless fish, were still present, but declining. Rising to prominence were the placoderms, a group unique to the Devonian, armoured fish with movable bony head shields, including some of the largest fish of their time. Dunkleosteus, perhaps the most famous placoderm, had a skull nearly 1.5 meters long and a body perhaps 3 to 6 meters in length. Its jaws did not have true teeth, but instead had sharpened edges of bone that were self-sharpening, wearing against each other in a way that maintained their cutting edge. The estimated bite force of Dunkleosteus has been calculated at several thousand newtons, making it one of the most powerfully biting creatures of its era, an apex predator of the late Devonian Ocean. The placoderms went entirely extinct at the end of the Devonian, victims of the late Devonian mass extinction. They left no descendants. But before they disappeared, they had dominated the ocean for 100 million years, a dynasty as long as the entire Cenozoic era. Replacing them in the Carboniferous and Permian oceans were the chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fish, sharks and rays and their relatives. Sharks are ancient. The earliest sharks predate the Devonian. But the Carboniferous saw a remarkable diversification of shark forms, including some that look extremely unlike modern sharks. Helicoprion had a jaw armed with a spiral of teeth, each new tooth growing from the centre and pushing the old ones outward, creating a bizarre wound-up spiral that has puzzled paleontologists since the first specimens were discovered. Stethocyanthus, a male, had a modified dorsal fin shaped like an anvil, covered in small denticles whose function remains mysterious. The Permian Ocean, before the Great Dying, was one of the most complex marine ecosystems in Earth's history. Fusulinid foraminifera, single-celled organisms in calcium carbonate shells the size of a grain of rice, were so abundant in some environments that their shells form thick limestone beds across entire ocean basins. Ammonoids of dozens of species coiled their way through the water column. Marine reptiles were beginning to appear, venturing back into the ocean from their terrestrial ancestors. The reefs of the Permian were diverse, if somewhat different in composition from the reefs before or after, and then the Great Dying erased most of it. The recovery, as we have touched on, was slow. The early and middle Triassic oceans were simplified, dominated by a few opportunistic survivors. But by the late Triassic and early Jurassic, the oceans had rebuilt themselves into complex ecosystems once more, this time dominated by different organisms, marine reptiles rather than placoderms, ammonoids and belemnites rather than nautiloids, modern-style sharks rather than carboniferous forms. The Mesozoic oceans were, in their way, as spectacular as the Paleozoic oceans had been. Different actors, different ecology, but equally complex, equally productive, equally full of the extraordinary and the enormous. Leopleurodon, a pliosaur from the Jurassic, with a skull 4 meters long and an estimated total body length of perhaps 6 to 7 meters, though popular media has exaggerated this to comic extremes. Shonisaurus, an ichthyosaur from the Triassic of Nevada, perhaps 20 meters long, making it one of the largest marine reptiles ever discovered. Mosasaurus, a late Cretaceous, relative of modern monitor lizards that returned to the sea, and evolved into a streamlined ocean predator perhaps 17 meters long. All of these creatures swam in oceans that no human has ever seen. Oceans whose chemistry, temperature, circulation, and ecology were profoundly different from today's. Oceans that were part of a world so foreign it requires sustained imagination just to begin to picture it. And yet, these were our oceans too. This was our planet. These ancient seas were the home of our most distant vertebrate ancestors, those tiny jawless fish scrabbling in the bottom sediment of Ordovician shallow waters. Without those seas, without that ancient marine world in all its exotic complexity, we would not be here. The ocean made us. Before our ancestors ever set foot on land, the ocean held them for hundreds of millions of years, shaping them, testing them, forcing them to evolve the features that would eventually let them leave. And then it let them go. There are chapters of the Paleozoic that we have moved through quickly, and they deserve more of our attention. The Silurian and Devonian periods in particular are fascinating for reasons beyond the dramatic events at their boundaries. The Silurian period, roughly 444 to 419 million years ago, is often overlooked. It lacks the explosive diversity of the Cambrian, the mass extinctions of the Ordovician, the famous fish and forest formations of the Devonian. But it was a period of genuine and important change. After the late Ordovician mass extinction, the ocean slowly recovered. New reef systems appeared, built by different organisms than before. The tabulate corals, those colonial hexagonal structures that look like honeycomb in cross-section, became the dominant reef builders. The stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that secreted massive calcium carbonate structures, grew alongside them. The Silurian coral reefs were not as extensive as the great reef systems of the Devonian that followed, but they were ecologically significant. They provided habitat for dozens of invertebrate species. In the shallow waters of the tropical Silurian seas, these reefs were centres of biological activity and diversity, their three-dimensional structures providing homes and hunting grounds for generations of animals. The Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, reached their maximum diversity and size in the Silurian. Pterygotus, one of the largest, reached lengths of perhaps 2.5 meters. It had large forward-facing eyes, providing excellent binocular vision, powerful chelicerae for grasping prey, and a long, flexible tail. It was probably the apex predator of shallow Silurian seas. But the sea scorpions were not limited to the ocean. Some lineages had adaptations for breathing air and may have spent significant time out of water. They may have been the first large animals to emerge onto land, scavenging or hunting the insects and other invertebrates that were beginning to colonize the terrestrial zone. The Silurian also saw the first true vascular plants. The plants that had colonized land in the Ordovician were non-vascular. They lacked the specialized conducting tissues that modern plants use to move water and nutrients through their bodies. This limited their size and their ability to survive dry conditions. Vascular plants, with their xylem and phloem, could grow taller, reach deeper water sources, and colonize drier environments. Cooksonia, found in Silurian rocks, is one of the earliest known vascular plants. It was small, just a few centimeters tall, with branching stems but no leaves, photosynthesizing through the green tissue of the stems themselves. But the plumbing was there, the conducting tissues that allowed it to move water up from the soil and sugars down from the photosynthetic zone. These early vascular plants were the founders of a dynasty. From them descended every tree, every bush, every flower, every grass that has ever grown on Earth. The forests we have been talking about throughout this story, the coal swamps and the conifer forests, and the flowering plant communities of the Cretaceous, all trace their origins to those first small branchless stems of Silurian Cooksonia. The Devonian period that followed was, as we have touched on, the age of fishes. But it was also the age of the first true forests, and the age when vertebrates first colonized land in a meaningful way, and the age of some of the most dramatic reef systems in Earth's history. The Great Barrier Reef of today is roughly 2,300 kilometers long. The reef systems of the Devonian covered the shallow continental margins of multiple continents, their total extent likely exceeding any modern reef system. They were built primarily by a different set of organisms than modern reefs, stromatoporoids rather than scleractinian corals as the primary framework builders, but they functioned in similar ways. And the fish. Oh, the fish. The Devonian seas contained a diversity of fish that would astonish any modern ichthyologist. The arthrodires, a group of placoderms, included not only the enormous Dunkleosteus we mentioned, but dozens of smaller species in various ecological roles. The Antiarchs, another placoderm group, had bizarre box-like armoured heads and pectoral fins enclosed in bone, almost like mechanical arms. They were probably bottom feeders, using their rigid fin limbs to prop themselves up as they fed on sediment. The acanthodians, sometimes called spiny sharks, though they were not true sharks, were small, torpedo-shaped fish with multiple pairs of fins, each supported at the front by a bony spine. They filled the niches that small, fast-swimming fish fill in modern ecosystems, mid-water pursuit predators and large-skull grazers on plankton. The lungfish appeared in the Devonian. These remarkable animals had lungs as well as gills, allowing them to breathe air when their water bodies dried up. Modern lungfish found in Africa, Australia and South America are living fossils whose anatomy is remarkably similar to their Devonian ancestors. They can survive in dried-up lake beds, buried in cocoons of mucus, breathing air through their lungs for years at a time. Their ability to tolerate extreme conditions of the kind that the Devonian seasonal landscapes produced may be why their lineage has survived unchanged for 400 million years. The coelacanths also appeared in the Devonian. They were common throughout the Paleozoic and Mesozoic, their lobed fins and distinctive body plan appearing in fossil beds from multiple continents. They were thought to have gone extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. Then, in 1938, a living coelacanth was caught off the coast of South Africa. It was one of the most sensational zoological discoveries of the 20th century. Since then, 2 living species have been identified, both in the deep waters of the Indian Ocean. They are, in the most direct possible sense, windows into the Devonian world. When scientists analysed the genome of the coelacanth, they found that it has one of the slowest rates of genetic change of any known vertebrate. Its genome today is remarkably similar to its ancestor's genome hundreds of millions of years ago. The coelacanth is, in a profound sense, a living representative of the pre-tetrapod vertebrate world. If you could somehow meet a coelacanth underwater, you would be looking at something that was ancient when the first forests were young, something that watched the transition from sea to land from the ocean side, something that swam through Devonian waters among creatures whose bones now form the limestone of continents. The Devonian ended badly, as we have noted. The late Devonian extinction was drawn out over millions of years, a series of pulses rather than a single event. The reef systems collapsed. The diverse fish faunas were decimated. The Eurypterids began their long decline. The trilobites, still diverse and abundant at the start of the Devonian, were reduced to a remnant. But the tetrapods, those transitional creatures we talked about who were learning to walk on land, survived. Some of them, at least. The lineages that had begun to exploit the terrestrial environment found that their new skills had advantages in the ecological chaos of the extinction aftermath. And from those few surviving lineages, the next phase of the story was launched. 400 million years ago, the land was beginning to change. If you had stood on the edge of a Silurian continent and looked inland, you would not have seen the barren wasteland of the Hadean or the windswept rock plains of the Archean. You would have seen something new, something green, low, creeping mats of primitive plants, cushions of ancient mosses and liverworts hugging the wet ground near streams and lakes, tiny stems with no true leaves, just green photosynthetic tissue rising a few centimetres from the soil, the first root-like structures called rhizoids, anchoring them to the rock and pulling up water. It was not impressive by later standards, but it was revolutionary. These early land plants were doing something no living thing had done before in the history of the planet. They were transforming rock into soil on a continental scale. Their chemical activities, the acids released by their rhizoids as they broke down rock minerals, their organic matter accumulating and decomposing into the first true soils, their roots physically cracking and fragmenting stone, were slowly, patiently, relentlessly making the land habitable. And where plants went, animals followed. The first terrestrial animals were probably arthropods, small, many-legged creatures that had already mastered the marine environment in many forms. Centipede-like organisms, early relatives of arachnids, mites and their relatives, colonizing the damp margins of the land and feeding on the plant material accumulating there. But the truly dramatic chapter in the conquest of land came during the Devonian period, roughly 419 to 359 million years ago. This is sometimes called the Age of Fishes, and with good reason. The Devonian oceans were dominated by fish of extraordinary diversity and size, but on land something was happening that would prove even more consequential. The forests were growing. By the middle of the Devonian, roughly 380 million years ago, the first true forests appeared on Earth. Not the dense canopied ecosystems we recognise today, but something strange and magnificent in its own right. Forests of scale trees, sigillaria, and lepidodendron, rising 15 to 30 metres from the ground, their bark patterned with diamond-shaped leaf scars like scales on a reptile's skin. Forests of early ferns and horsetails growing in the damp hollows between the larger trees. Forests of progymnosperms, the ancestors of seed plants, with woody trunks and fern-like leaves. These were the first truly tall plants on Earth. For hundreds of millions of years before, life had been low to the ground, clinging to moisture, unable to reach for the sun in any meaningful way. Now, suddenly, organisms were building wooden scaffolding up toward the light, competing with each other for access to the energy source that drove everything. The forests changed the planet's chemistry profoundly. All that photosynthesis was pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at extraordinary rates, and all that wood, that cellulose and lignin piling up on the forest floor, was not being decomposed efficiently, because the microorganisms capable of breaking down lignin, the tough structural compound that gives wood its strength, had not yet evolved. The Devonian and early Carboniferous periods may have seen the lowest atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in Earth's history as a result, and low carbon dioxide meant less greenhouse warming, which meant the planet cooled. This cooling contributed to another major extinction, the late Devonian mass extinction, roughly 375 million years ago, which killed approximately 75% of all species. The marine ecosystems were hit hardest. Those extraordinary Devonian reef systems, which had rivaled the Great Barrier Reef in scale and complexity, collapsed almost entirely. But on land, the forests were spreading, and in those forests, one of the most consequential transitions in the history of vertebrate life was quietly underway. Fish were learning to walk. This was not a sudden transformation. It took tens of millions of years. It began with a group of fish called the lobe-finned fish, whose paired fins had an internal skeletal structure much more elaborate than those of other fish. Instead of a fan of thin rays supported by a single bone at the base, lobe-finned, fish had fins supported by a series of bones that articulated against each other. In some species, these fins became strong enough and flexible enough to push against the substrate, to prop the body up, to allow movement in shallow water or along muddy banks in ways that normal fins could not. The most famous of these transitional organisms is Tiktaalik, discovered in Canadian Arctic sediments in 2004. Tiktaalik lived roughly 375 million years ago and represents an extraordinary intermediate between fish and the first land vertebrates, the tetrapods. It had a flat crocodile-like head with eyes on top, a short neck, and fins that contained bones homologous to the bones in your own arm and wrist. It could prop itself up on its fins and move in ways that fish simply cannot. The tetrapods that followed Tiktaalik were not fully terrestrial. The earliest ones, creatures like Ichthyostega and Acanthostega from Greenland, were more like aquatic animals that could occasionally venture onto land. They still had tails adapted for swimming. They breathed air but probably spent most of their time in water. Their legs, while recognizable as legs, were poorly suited for sustained terrestrial locomotion. But they were a beginning, a bridge between the ocean that had nurtured animal life for hundreds of millions of years and the land that was waiting to be colonized in all its complexity. The Carboniferous period, which followed the Devonian, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, saw the full flowering of terrestrial ecosystems. This is the period that gave us coal. Not immediately, not from a single event, but from hundreds of millions of years of dead trees piling up in swamp forests, compressed by the weight of more material above them, slowly cooking under pressure into the carbon-rich black rock that would one day power the Industrial Revolution. The Carboniferous coal swamps were extraordinary ecosystems, vast, wet, warm, shadowed by scale trees 40 meters tall, thick with ferns and horsetails buzzing with insects that had evolved to exploit this new environment. The dragonflies of the Carboniferous were the largest flying insects that have ever existed. Meganeura, a genus of griffinfly related to modern dragonflies, had wingspans of up to 70 centimeters, more than 2 feet from wingtip to wingtip. The high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous atmosphere, perhaps 35% compared to today's 21%, allowed insects to grow to sizes that would be physiologically impossible today. Giant millipedes, Arthropleura, crawled through the leaf litter, some of them reaching 2.5 meters in length, the largest arthropods that ever walked the land. And in these swampy forests, the tetrapods were evolving, diversifying, finding new ways to exploit the abundant resources the land now offered. One of the most important innovations of the Carboniferous was the amniotic egg, the egg with a membrane, the amnion, that encloses the embryo in its own private pond of fluid, protecting it from drying out, allowing the embryo to develop fully before hatching. This innovation freed vertebrates from the need to return to water to reproduce. For the first time, animals could live their entire lives on land. The first amniotes, the animals with amniotic eggs, appeared roughly 320 million years ago. They were small, lizard-like creatures, scurrying through the coal forests hunting insects and small invertebrates. Unremarkable by any outward measure. But they carried within them the potential for everything that followed. From these small amniotes would descend the reptiles, the birds and the mammals, the entire terrestrial vertebrate diversity of the modern world. Your own lineage began with one of those small creatures in the Carboniferous coal swamp. Take a moment with that thought. You are here, resting, in the quiet dark, because 320 million years ago, in a swamp that is now a coal seam somewhere in North America or Europe, a small reptile-like animal kept its embryos wrapped in fluid membranes rather than exposed to the drying air. Biology is patience, slow, quiet, patient investment in the future, much like sleep. Let us slow down even further and spend more time in those extraordinary coal forests. The Carboniferous period, 360 to 299 million years ago, is one of the most fascinating and least discussed chapters of life's history. It is the period that gave us most of our coal reserves, the compressed remains of those ancient swamp forests that powered the Industrial Revolution and still drive energy systems today. But the forests themselves, the living, breathing, buzzing, crawling, photosynthesizing forests of the Carboniferous, were unlike anything that has ever existed before or since. The most important thing to understand about Carboniferous forests is their scale. They were vast, truly vast. They covered much of what would become North America and Europe, at that time joined together as part of the supercontinent Laurussia, as well as portions of Gondwana in the south. Dense, humid, warm, lit by a sun filtering through a canopy of scale tree fronds 40 meters overhead. The scale trees, the lycopsids, were the dominant organisms of the coal swamps. Lepidodendron was perhaps the most abundant. Its trunk, smooth and green when young, developed the distinctive diamond-patterned bark as it matured, each diamond marking the scar of a shed leaf. Near the top, the trunk divided into 2 branches, and those into 2 more, and so on, creating a rounded crown of narrow, grass-like leaves that waved in whatever breeze reached through the canopy. Sigillaria was similar but taller, some individuals reaching 35 meters, its trunk marked by parallel rows of leaf scars. Calamites, the giant horsetails, filled the margins of swamp waters, their jointed, hollow stems reaching heights of 10 to 15 meters, forming impenetrable thickets along riverbanks that the largest animals could not easily penetrate. Underneath this canopy, in the deep shadow of the forest floor, it was perpetually twilight. The humidity was extreme. Fungal networks spread through the thick layer of accumulated organic matter. Liverworts and primitive mosses carpeted every wet surface. Ferns of dozens of species covered the ground, their fronds dripping with condensation. And the insects. We touched on Meganeura earlier, those giant griffinflies with 70-centimeter wingspans. But they were just the most dramatic of a truly extraordinary insect fauna. The Carboniferous was the golden age of insects in many respects. Without the evolutionary refinement of their eventual predators, the flying vertebrates, the birds and bats that would not appear for hundreds of millions of years, and with the high oxygen atmosphere that allowed respiratory systems to support larger bodies, insects reached sizes and diversities that boggle the mind. Arthropleura, the giant millipede we mentioned, crawled through the leaf litter at lengths of 2.5 meters, its many legs moving in coordinated waves beneath an armored body that would have been as wide as your shoulder span. It was almost certainly an herbivore, feeding on the abundant plant material of the forest floor. No predator alive at the time was large enough to trouble it seriously. Early cockroaches, already recognizable as cockroaches in their general form, scurried through the debris. They have changed remarkably little in 300 million years. Dragonfly relatives of several species fill the skies, their compound eyes tracking insects on the wing. Flying insects had appeared in the Devonian, but the Carboniferous is when they truly diversified into the ecological roles they still occupy. The amphibians were the dominant vertebrates of the coal swamps. Not the small, delicate frogs and salamanders we know today, but massive creatures, some more than 2 meters long, that patrolled the swamp waters with the efficiency of modern crocodiles. Eriops, perhaps the best known, had a broad, flat skull with powerful jaws and sprawling limbs that let it haul its large body onto land when necessary. But it was at its most dangerous in the water, ambushing prey from shallow hiding spots. Temnospondyls, the most diverse group of Paleozoic amphibians, ranged in size from small insectivores to large apex predators. Some had extraordinary skull shapes, long-snouted fish-eaters, or wide-skulled ambush hunters. The diversity of temnospondyls in the Carboniferous coal swamps rivals the diversity of crocodilians in a modern tropical river system. But the most significant vertebrates of the Carboniferous, from the perspective of our own eventual existence, were the first amniotes, those small, lizard-like creatures that scurried through the leaf litter of the coal forests with their revolutionary eggs. Hylonomus, from the Joggins Formation in Nova Scotia, is often cited as one of the earliest known amniotes. It was small, perhaps 20 centimeters long, slender-bodied, probably insectivorous. Its fossils are found in remarkable circumstances, preserved inside the hollow stumps of fallen sigillaria trees, where individuals apparently fell in while hunting insects and were unable to climb out. In those hollow stumps, many thousands of years of fallen individuals accumulated, each one a small tragedy, each one now a window into the most significant transition in vertebrate history. Now, about that mystery of the missing decomposers. For the Carboniferous coal forests to have produced the vast coal deposits we mine today, something extraordinary had to happen. All that wood, all those fallen trees, all that accumulated organic matter had to be buried without being decomposed. In a modern forest, a fallen tree rots. Bacteria, fungi, insects, and other organisms break it down within years or decades, recycling its carbon back into the atmosphere and the soil. In the Carboniferous, this recycling was dramatically slower than in the modern world. The leading hypothesis is that the organisms capable of breaking down lignin, the tough polymer that gives wood its structural strength, had not yet fully evolved. Lignin is a remarkably resistant molecule. White rot fungi, the primary modern decomposers of woody material, use a specific family of enzymes called peroxidases to break it down. These enzymes may not have evolved until the end of the Carboniferous, or into the Permian period. This means that for tens of millions of years, when trees fell in the Carboniferous swamps, they did not fully decompose. They accumulated. Layer upon layer of fallen wood, compressing under its own weight, gradually being buried under sediment subjected to heat and pressure over millions of years and slowly transformed into coal. This process pulled enormous quantities of carbon out of the active carbon cycle. Carbon that had been carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was captured by photosynthesis, incorporated into wood, and then buried before it could be released again. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels fell dramatically during the Carboniferous as a result. This contributed significantly to global cooling, which contributed to the glaciations of the late Carboniferous and the ecological upheaval of the Permian. And those vast coal deposits, the legacy of those undecomposed forests, are now being burned in power stations and released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide at rates hundreds or thousands of times faster than they accumulated. The irony is breathtaking when you think about it. The undecomposed forests of 300 million years ago, preserved by the absence of wood-rotting fungi, are now being returned to the atmosphere by human, industrial activity. The carbon of those ancient trees is being recirculated, completing a cycle that was interrupted for hundreds of millions of years. The Carboniferous coal swamps are not as distant from your life as they might seem. The electricity that powers the light you read by, the heat that warms your house, in many parts of the world, these things come directly from those ancient forests. from those dragonflies and giant millipedes and first amniotes, and the great green canopy that covered the world 300 million years ago. Rest in that connection. The ancient world is not gone. It is woven into the fabric of the present in ways more direct and more intimate than we usually recognize. The coal forest breathed into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere breathed into them, and their bodies became our fuel, and that fuel burns and breathes into the atmosphere again. Carbon cycling through the world. One long, slow breath spanning hundreds of millions of years. You are breathing some of those atoms right now. The carbon in your exhaled breath may include atoms that were once part of a carboniferous giant dragonfly, a lepidodendron tree, an ancient hylonomus hunting insects in a hollow stump. The world is more connected than it appears, more continuous, more ancient, more present. When the first forests appeared on land, roughly 380 million years ago in the Devonian, they did not just change the landscape, they changed the planet. Let us think carefully about what a forest is and what it does. A forest is a solar energy collector. Every leaf is a panel absorbing light, using that energy to pull carbon dioxide out of the air and incorporate it into organic molecules. A large forest can move enormous quantities of carbon, cycling it between the atmosphere, the soil, and the bodies of organisms on timescales of years to centuries. Before forests, this carbon cycling on land was minimal. There was photosynthesis performed by low-growing mats of green algae and early bryophytes, but on a small scale. The land surface was mostly bare rock, and the interaction between rock and atmosphere was limited. Forests changed everything. The trees of the first Devonian forests had roots. Real roots, not just the shallow, anchoring structures of earlier plants, but deep root systems that penetrated cracks in rock, physically breaking it apart and chemically dissolving the minerals within. This process, biological weathering, was dramatically more efficient than purely physical weathering by water and wind. The first forests accelerated the breakdown of rock many times over, and the breakdown of rock has a critical consequence for the global carbon cycle. It draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. When feldspar, a common rock-forming mineral, reacts with water and carbon dioxide, it produces clay minerals plus calcium and bicarbonate ions in solution. Those ions eventually wash into the ocean where they are used by marine organisms to build calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. When those organisms die, their shells sink to the seafloor and are buried, taking their carbon with them. This process, the weathering of silicate rocks and the burial of marine carbonate, is the primary long-term mechanism by which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere and stored in rocks for millions to hundreds of millions of years. The first forest dramatically accelerated this process. More roots meant more biological weathering, meant more carbon dioxide drawn down from the atmosphere, meant cooler global temperatures. The Devonian forests are believed to have contributed significantly to the global cooling and glaciation that ended the Devonian period and the Devonian Carboniferous extinction. Life was changing the planet, and the planet was changing in response in ways that then changed life. Feedback loops, vast and slow, cycling on timescales of tens of millions of years, but operating just as surely as the feedback loops in a modern thermostat. The early Carboniferous saw the full development of the coal swamp forests we have already described. But there is another aspect of those forests worth dwelling on: their extraordinary biodiversity. Not just of plants, which were remarkable enough, but of everything that lived within and among those plants. The amphibians of the coal swamps were not just large predators. There was an entire community of smaller amphibians, insectivores, molluscivores, fish-eaters, organisms that specialized in different prey sizes and hunting strategies. The fossil record from the Carboniferous preserves multiple species of amphibian living together in the same ecosystem, suggesting a level of ecological complexity and resource partitioning comparable to modern freshwater ecosystems. The earliest reptiles were ecologically diverse too. Some were small insectivores, others show evidence of a more herbivorous diet, with teeth suited for processing plant material. Still others were likely aquatic or semi-aquatic, hunting in the swamp waters. The Carboniferous saw the first radiation of the amniotes into multiple ecological roles. The coal swamp ecosystems were self-contained in a way that modern ecosystems are not. Unlike modern forests, where significant nutrient input comes from the ocean through rain and migrating animals, the Carboniferous swamps were largely closed nutrient cycles. The organic matter produced by photosynthesis accumulated in the swamp was consumed by animals and fungi and bacteria, and the nutrients were recycled within the system. Almost nothing escaped permanently into the ocean. The waterways carried some sediment and dissolved minerals, but the bulk of the carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus cycled within the forest. This closed, self-sustaining quality of the coal forests is what made them so productive and so long-lasting. They were ecological islands in a landscape still largely dominated by bare rock and shallow soils, but within those islands, a complete and complex world had been assembled. And then, at the end of the Carboniferous, as the climate cooled and dried, the coal swamps began to contract. The vast forests of the western Pangaean lowlands fragmented, their continuity broken by expanding dry areas, their populations of animals isolating into pockets and diverging genetically. This fragmentation is called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. It occurred roughly 307 million years ago. The coal swamps did not disappear entirely. They persisted in refuges, reduced in extent, surviving through the Permian in some regions. But the great connected coal forest world of the early and middle Carboniferous was over, and the fragmentation drove evolution. Species isolated in pockets diversified. The amniotes, in particular, took advantage of their superior ability to tolerate drier conditions and colonize the expanding non-swamp environments. The pelycosaurs and other early synapsids spread into the uplands and drylands that were now spreading across Pangaea, filling ecological niches that the coal swamp amphibians could not access. This was the beginning of the synapsid rise to dominance. The coal forests made the synapsids possible by providing the ecological complexity and productivity in which the first amniotes could diversify. And then the collapse of the coal forests made the synapsids dominant by providing them with a vast new terrestrial world to colonize, while their competitors, the amphibians, were constrained to the remaining wet areas. One world ending, another beginning. The pattern is relentless throughout Earth's history. Each ending enables a beginning. Each catastrophe creates an opportunity. The world is not a static system with occasional disturbances. It is a dynamic system in continuous transformation, driven by geological forces and biological feedback loops and astronomical cycles, changing always, never at rest, always in the process of becoming something new. You live in one moment of that process. The forests outside your window, whatever they are, the wetlands or grasslands or deserts or oceans, are not the permanent features they appear to be. They are the current configuration of a world in flux, a snapshot from the long, slow movie of Earth's history. In the deep past, the world has been entirely different. In the deep future, it will be different again. And through all of it, the thread of life continues, adapting, diversifying, occasionally nearly breaking, but never quite breaking, never quite breaking. There is a chapter of life's history that most people skip over entirely. They know about the dinosaurs, they know about the mammals that came after. But there was a period, stretching across tens of millions of years, when neither dinosaurs nor mammals existed. And in that period, the world was ruled by a group of creatures that were neither the one nor the other. They were the synapsids, and their story is one of the most remarkable in the history of life. The synapsids, sometimes called the mammal-like reptiles, though that name is somewhat misleading, since they are more accurately the ancestors of mammals rather than reptiles proper, first appeared in the late Carboniferous, roughly 320 million years ago. They began as small, unremarkable amniotes, similar in appearance to their contemporaries. But they had a feature that set them apart, a single opening in the skull behind the eye socket, an opening that allowed for the attachment of larger jaw muscles. This seemingly minor anatomical detail would prove to be the foundation of an evolutionary dynasty that lasted 250 million years and eventually produced every mammal alive today. Through the Permian period, roughly 299 to 252 million years ago, the synapsids became the dominant large vertebrates on land. The early Permian was ruled by the pelycosaurs, a diverse group of primitive synapsids that included some of the most visually distinctive creatures of the Paleozoic. Dimetrodon, perhaps the best known, was not a dinosaur. It is often mistaken for one in popular media, but it lived more than 50 million years before the first dinosaur appeared. Dimetrodon was a large, roughly 4-meter-long predator with a dramatic sail on its back, formed by elongated vertebral spines connected by skin that may have functioned in thermoregulation, absorbing or radiating heat depending on the animal's needs. Other pelycosaurs were herbivores. Edaphosaurus, similar in form to Dimetrodon but with a more robust body and blunt teeth suited to processing plant material, grazed the Permian coastal lowlands alongside the predators that hunted it. But the pelycosaurs were just the beginning. As the Permian continued, a more advanced group of synapsids appeared, the therapsids, and they would come to dominate the planet in ways their pelycosaur predecessors never had. The therapsids included creatures of extraordinary diversity. Some were small insectivores, no larger than a modern shrew. Others were massive herbivores, the dicynodonts with their turtle-like beaks and tusks that moved in herds across the Permian landscape. The dinocephalians, literally terrible heads, were enormous barrel-bodied herbivores and predators, some weighing several tons. But the most interesting therapsids, from the perspective of our own lineage, were the cynodonts, the group that most closely approached the mammalian condition. Late Permian cynodonts show features that look startlingly mammalian when you examine their fossils closely. Differentiated teeth, with distinct incisors, canines, and cheek teeth specialized for different functions, unlike the simple, uniform teeth of most reptiles. Expanded jawbones with complex articulations, skull proportions that suggest expanded, brain volumes relative to body size, and in at least some species, evidence of whisker pits in the snout bones, suggesting the presence of whiskers, which in modern mammals are innervated sensory organs embedded in skin, which in turn implies the presence of at least facial skin with sensory functions, which implies not scales but something softer. Some paleontologists believe that at least some advanced therapsids may have been partially warm-blooded. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Their bone microstructure, visible under a microscope, shows patterns more consistent with rapid, sustained growth, as in modern, warm-blooded animals, rather than the slow, seasonal growth ring seen in modern reptiles. Their posture was more erect than typical reptiles, suggesting a more active lifestyle. Some may have had simple fur or fur-like insulation. The Permian world in which these creatures thrived was dominated by the supercontinent Pangaea. The land was arid, rainfall was seasonal and violent. Vast desert interiors lay beyond the reach of coastal moisture. The forests were not the coal swamps of the Carboniferous, but drier woodlands dominated by seed plants, Glossopteris, and Dicroidium, and their relatives, adapted to seasonal drought. In this world, the therapsids thrived. They filled every available ecological niche. Predators and prey, large and small, specialized and generalist. For 20 million years, they were the undisputed masters of the terrestrial world. And then the world ended. The Permian Triassic extinction event, sometimes called the Great Dying, occurred approximately 252 million years ago. It is the most severe mass extinction in the history of complex life. Perhaps 96% of all marine species went extinct. Perhaps 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. The entire planetary ecosystem was pushed to the edge of total collapse. The cause was volcanic activity of almost incomprehensible scale. The Siberian Traps, a massive flood basalt province in what is now northern Russia, erupted for roughly 2 million years, releasing enough lava to bury the entire continental United States under a layer of rock 100 meters thick. More importantly, the eruptions released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other volatile gases into the atmosphere, triggering catastrophic global warming, ocean acidification, and the collapse of marine oxygen levels. In the aftermath, the world was nearly empty. The rich, complex ecosystems of the late Permian were gone. Their place was taken by barren, stress-tolerant organisms, fungal blooms feeding on dead forests, simple microbial mats in the ocean, small generalist survivors that could make do with whatever resources remained. The synapsids survived, but barely. Most lineages went extinct. Only the cynodonts and dicynodonts, the most adaptable of the therapsids, clung to existence in the wreckage of the world, and into that wreckage the survivors crept, battered, reduced, numerically tiny, but alive. For millions of years after the extinction, the world slowly recovered. The Triassic period began not in triumph, but in triage, a damaged world stitching itself back together from whatever biological material remained. The synapsids that survived the Great Dying continued to evolve. The cynodonts, in particular, diversified into numerous forms during the early and middle Triassic. Some became large predators, others were small insectivores, a few became specialized herbivores, but they were no longer alone. From the surviving archosaurs, the group that had been only minor players in the Permian, something new was emerging, something fast, something efficient, something that would eventually displace the synapsids from the dominant positions they had held for so long. The archosaurs were splitting into two great lineages. One would eventually give rise to the crocodilians, the other would give rise to the dinosaurs, and the world was about to change again. But not before one of those small, battered cynodont lineages pulled off one of the most improbable comebacks in the history of life. Not now, not in the Triassic, but eventually in the shadows cast by giant dinosaurs, carrying the innovations honed in the hard times of the Permian and the recovery of the Triassic. The cynodonts were refining themselves. They were becoming mammals. It would take 150 million years, but they had the time. Rest in that thought for a while. The patience of evolution, the long, quiet arc of biological time, bending always toward complexity, toward warmth, toward awareness, even in catastrophe, even in the aftermath of near-total extinction, even in the shadow of giant predators. Life finds its way, slowly, patiently, with an endurance that puts human perseverance to shame. Before the Great Dying came, the Permian world had reached a kind of extraordinary complexity. 260 million years ago, roughly 10 million years before the end-Permian extinction, the supercontinent Pangaea was assembled. All the land on Earth joined into one vast mass stretching from pole to pole. The Panthalassic Ocean, one continuous body of water, surrounded it on all sides. The Tethys Sea, a triangular wedge of warm tropical water, opened between the northern and southern portions of Pangaea in the east. The climate was complex, not uniformly extreme, as is sometimes portrayed. The coastal regions of Pangaea, both along the main ocean coast and along the shores of the Tethys, were warm and seasonally wet. The interior was dry but not dead. The high latitudes, both north and south, experienced cooler, more seasonal conditions, and across this varied landscape the therapsids had built a world. The dicynodonts deserve particular attention. These were herbivorous therapsids with remarkable variety in body size and ecological niche. Some were tiny, the size of rats, burrowing in the ground and eating roots and tubers. Others were massive, the size of modern hippos or larger, moving in herds across the Permian lowlands. The largest known dicynodont, Lysowicia, from what is now Poland, reached an estimated body mass of 9 tons, comparable to a large elephant. What made dicynodonts so successful? Their jaws were remarkable. Most had only 2 teeth, the tusks preserved in many species. The rest of the jaw was covered by a keratinous beak, like a tortoise's, that could crop and process vegetation with considerable efficiency. They could eat a wide variety of plant material, from tough grasses to soft leaves to roots. This dietary flexibility made them resilient to environmental changes that would have devastated more specialized feeders. The dicynodonts were so successful that some lineages survived the end-Permian extinction and went on to become important members of the early and middle Triassic ecosystems. The genus Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized dicynodont, became perhaps the most abundant land vertebrate on Earth in the immediate aftermath of the extinction. Some fossil beds from the early Triassic are dominated almost entirely by Lystrosaurus. They were the cockroaches of the Permian-Triassic boundary, generalist survivors that thrived when almost everything else was dying. The Gorgonopsians were the apex predators of the late Permian. They were large, muscular therapists with skulls equipped with long, saber-like canine teeth that could measure over 10 centimeters in some species. Their gait was more erect than typical for their time, suggesting greater agility than the more sprawling reptiles they competed with. They were the lions and the wolves and the bears of the Permian world, filling the top predator roles across multiple continents. Gorgonopsians had features that look remarkably mammalian when you examine them carefully. The differentiated teeth indicate different functions for different teeth, a mammalian characteristic. The skull proportions suggest a relatively large brain for an animal of this period. Some specimens show evidence of possible whisker pits, those tiny holes in the snout bones through which whisker follicles pass in modern mammals. Were Gorgonopsians warm-blooded? We cannot say with certainty, but they may have been at least partially elevated in metabolism compared to typical reptiles, capable of sustained activity in ways their cold-blooded cousins could not match. This would have made them formidable predators. The Gorgonopsians did not survive the Permian extinction. Not a single lineage made it through. They were among the many success stories of the Permian world that were simply wiped from existence. The plant world of the Permian was equally sophisticated. The Glossopteris flora, dominated by the Glossopteris seed ferns, covered the southern portions of Gondwana in dense forests. These forests are particularly remarkable because their fossils are found in Antarctica, in rocks now buried under kilometres of glacial ice. In the Permian, Antarctica lay further north and had a temperate climate that supported substantial forests. Glossopteris leaves, tongue-shaped with a prominent central rib and a network of fine veins, are found in enormous quantities in Permian-aged rocks throughout the former Gondwana landmasses. Southern Africa, India, Australia, South America, and Antarctica. They are the fossil that helped convince scientists in the 20th century that these now separated continents had once been joined. The same plant cannot be growing simultaneously on continents separated by thousands of miles of ocean without some physical connection between them. The realization that these scattered continents were once one landmass, that the familiar map of the world is just the current frame of a very long movie, that the configuration of land and sea we take as permanent is in fact fluid and temporary, is one of the great conceptual revolutions in the history of science. And Glossopteris leaves, pressed into black Permian shale, helped make it. As the Permian approached its end, the world showed no obvious sign of impending catastrophe. The therapsids were diverse and thriving, the marine ecosystems were complex and productive, the forests were spreading. Evolution was doing its patient work, generation by generation, slowly filling the space of possibilities, and then, in what must have seemed completely without warning to any organism alive at the time, the sky began to change colour. The first sign would have been in the air. Sulfur dioxide from the first major eruptions of the Siberian traps, mixing with water vapour, creating sulfuric acid aerosols in the upper atmosphere, gradually reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the surface. Days grew slightly darker. Temperatures began to fluctuate more wildly. The monsoons that had watered the coastal forests became unreliable. Then the ash began to fall. Fine volcanic ash, drifting on the upper atmosphere, circling the globe on jet stream winds, settling onto the leaves of forests thousands of miles from the eruption sites, coating the leaves, reducing their ability to photosynthesize, accumulating in streams and rivers, changing the chemistry of the water, falling into the ocean, fertilizing some areas while poisoning others. This was the beginning of the end, but the world did not know it yet. Life carried on, as life always carries on, as long as conditions remain within any range that any organism can tolerate. The tolerances were about to be tested, and most of life was going to fail, but not all of it. And in that not all, in that small, battered, depleted but living remnant, the future was hidden. The future was always hidden in the survivors. We have talked about the therapsids in overview. Let us now spend time in their world more directly, because it is a world worth inhabiting in imagination. Late Permian Gondwana, 260 million years ago, the southern portion of the supercontinent Pangaea, covering what will eventually become Antarctica, South Africa, India, Australia, and South America. The climate here is seasonal and temperate. The high southern latitudes experience genuine winters, cold enough to kill the less cold-tolerant reptiles. The Glossopteris forests cover the lowlands and the river valleys. Their tongue-shaped leaves shed in autumn and regrown in spring create a thick carpet of organic matter that supports a rich community of decomposers and the animals that eat them. In these forests, a herd of Lystrosaurus moves through the undergrowth. They are stocky animals, their bodies compact and low to the ground, their broad horny beaks cutting through the Glossopteris stems and leaves with mechanical efficiency. They are not impressive looking. They lack the drama of the large Gorgonopsians or the visual spectacle of the Pelycosaur sails. But they are supremely practical animals, well adapted to their world. Their legs are held more upright beneath their bodies than those of typical reptiles, giving them a somewhat more efficient gait. Their teeth show the beginnings of differentiation. The two tusks in the upper jaw are larger and more prominent than the cheek teeth. Their skull is a remarkable piece of evolutionary engineering, combining the beak, with the tusks in a way that gives them access to food sources that other animals cannot easily exploit. Roots, tubers, the woody stems of young Glossopteris trees. Watching them move through the forest, you notice something. They are social. They travel together. They call to each other, low grunting sounds that seem to communicate something about direction or food or danger. This social behaviour, not universally present in reptiles, is one of the features that will eventually become highly developed in their mammalian descendants. Behind the herd, a pair of Dicynodon watch. Different from Lystrosaurus in proportion, slightly more heavily built, their tusks longer. Dicynodon is another dicynodont, occupying a slightly different niche in the Permian ecosystem. They are more solitary than the Lystrosaurus herds, perhaps more selective in their feeding, perhaps more territorial. High in the Glossopteris canopy, a Claudiosaurus, a small diapsid reptile, clings to a branch. It is not a synapsid. It belongs to a different branch of the amniote family tree, but it is part of the same community, adding its own ecological contribution to the web of relationships that constitutes the forest ecosystem. And somewhere in the dense undergrowth near a small stream, moving carefully to avoid detection, a Thrinaxodon. This cynodont is small, perhaps the size of a large weasel. Its teeth are remarkable, differentiated incisors, prominent canines, and complex molliform cheek teeth capable of precise oral food processing. Its snout shows the pits where whisker follicles attach, suggesting its face was furred. Its skull proportions suggest a brain larger relative to body size than any of its competitors. Thrinaxodon is not dominant. It is small and secretive, avoiding the large dicynodonts and the occasional large Gorgonopsian predator. But it is sophisticated. It is learning, in evolutionary terms, to be a mammal. The cynodonts like Thrinaxodon that survived the Permian Triassic extinction and then diversified in the Triassic represent the most direct ancestors of the mammals. They were not yet mammals. By the standard taxonomic definition, mammals are characterized by, among other things, a particular arrangement of the jawbones. In mammals, the jaw is composed of a single bone, the dentary, while in all other amniotes, the lower jaw is composed of multiple bones. The cynodont jaw was intermediate. It was still composed of multiple bones, but the dentary was dramatically larger than in earlier. Synapsids and the other jawbones were dramatically smaller, reduced to small elements at the back of the jaw. In the most advanced cynodonts, those elements were tiny, barely functional as jawbones, and they were, in fact, in the process of being co-opted for a completely different function. In mammals, those former jawbones became the bones of the middle ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes. The same bones that transmit sound vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear in your own skull were, in your synapsid ancestors, parts of the jaw joint. The transformation of these bones is one of the most elegant examples of evolutionary repurposing in the entire history of life. The shift happened gradually. In transitional forms between cynodonts and true mammals, dated to the late Triassic and early Jurassic, you can see the process at an intermediate stage. These animals had a dual jaw joint, both the new dentary squamosal joint characteristic of mammals and the retained articular quadrate joint of non-mammalian amniotes. Two jaw joints simultaneously, the new one taking over function from the old one. And in the very earliest true mammals, those late Triassic animals from which all modern mammals descend, the old bones had finally detached from the jaw entirely and migrated backward, becoming the first genuinely mammalian middle ear bones. This story is not merely anatomical trivia, it is a window into the way evolution works, not by invention of entirely new structures from scratch, but by modification and repurposing of existing ones. The bones you use to hear with, that allow music and language and the sound of rain to reach your awareness, were once part of the jaw of a creature that chewed plants in a Permian forest. You carry the Permian in your ears. The therapsids gave us more than just our ear bones and our jaw structure. They gave us our metabolic strategy. Warm-bloodedness, endothermy, the generation of body heat from internal, metabolic processes rather than from external heat sources, was almost certainly present in at least some advanced cynodonts before the first true mammals appeared. The advantages of endothermy are enormous for an animal living in a seasonally variable environment. You can be active at night when cold-blooded competitors are sluggish. You can function in cold weather when reptiles are incapacitated. You can maintain steady activity levels throughout the day rather than needing to warm up in the morning sun. The cost is also enormous. A warm-blooded animal needs roughly 10 times as much food as a cold-blooded animal of the same size, simply to maintain its body temperature. But if the food is available, if the environment is rich enough in resources to support that energetic demand, the advantages of endothermy more than compensate. The Permian and Triassic environments were rich enough. The cynodonts could afford the metabolic cost, and so they paid it, and in paying it, they gained capabilities that would, over the next 200 million years, allow their descendants to conquer the world. We owe the therapsids more than most people realize. Every warm morning in bed, every ability to remain active through a cold winter night, every capacity for sustained effort over long periods. These are therapsid gifts. Gifts refined in the Permian forests and Triassic wastelands, passed down through 250 million years of mammalian evolution, arriving at you, in this moment, in this body that generates its own warmth against the cold dark. The therapsids are not gone. You are the therapsid. 230 million years ago, give or take, the first dinosaurs appeared on Earth. They were nothing special to look at. Small bipedal creatures, perhaps no larger than a turkey, running on their hind legs through the semi-arid landscapes of late Triassic Pangaea. They had long tails for balance, grasping hands with flexible fingers, and that characteristic upright posture, legs positioned directly beneath the body, that would prove to be one of the key innovations setting their lineage apart from the competition. But the world they were born into was about to undergo a transformation. The Carnian pluvial episode, which we touched on briefly earlier in this journey, fundamentally restructured Triassic ecosystems between roughly 234 and 232 million years ago. 2 million years of dramatically increased rainfall triggered by massive volcanic activity pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere killed off the dominant reptile groups that had shared the land with early dinosaurs. The Rauisuchians, massive crocodile-line archosaurs that had been the apex predators of the early Triassic. The Etosaurs, heavily armoured herbivores that had been among the most common large animals of the period. The Rhynchosaurs, pig-sized reptiles that had dominated the herbivore niches across multiple continents. All of them struggled, many went extinct, and into the vacated ecological space the dinosaurs expanded. By the late Triassic, roughly 210 million years ago, dinosaurs were already the dominant large vertebrates on land, and they were diversifying rapidly, filling the niches left empty by the extinctions of their competitors with extraordinary speed and evolutionary creativity. When the Triassic ended, roughly 201 million years ago in yet another mass extinction, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, the dinosaurs survived while many of their remaining competitors did not. And when the Jurassic period opened, the stage was set for the most spectacular act in the history of terrestrial life, the Jurassic dinosaurs. Picture a Jurassic landscape, roughly 150 million years ago. Pangaea is breaking apart now. The Atlantic Ocean is opening as a narrow seaway between what will become North America and Europe and Africa. The climate is warm, warmer than today, with no ice caps at the poles. Lush conifer forests stretch across vast areas. Tree ferns grow in the undergrowth. Ginkgo trees, almost identical to the ones planted in modern city streets, line the riverbanks. And through this landscape move creatures of extraordinary scale. Brachiosaurus, a sauropod dinosaur with an upward extending neck like a giraffe's, but multiplied many times over, allowing it to browse on the tops of conifers 30 meters above the ground. Its total body length was perhaps 26 meters. Its weight was perhaps 60 or 70 tons. When it walked, the ground shook. Its footprints left impressions half a meter deep in soft soil. It was, by any measure, one of the largest land animals that has ever existed. Diplodocus, another sauropod but longer and more lightly built, perhaps 30 meters from nose to tail, with a neck held more horizontally and a tail that tapered to a whip-like tip. Some researchers believe the largest individuals could crack their tails like a whip, creating a sonic boom as a defensive or communicative signal. Stegosaurus, a quadrupedal herbivore with 2 rows of alternating bony plates running down its back and a tail armed with 4 sharp spikes. The Thagomizer. These plates have been a subject of debate among paleontologists. They may have been used in thermoregulation, perhaps flushing with blood to radiate heat. They may have been used in display, flashing colours to potential mates or rivals. They may have served multiple functions simultaneously, and among these giants, the predators, Allosaurus, a bipedal carnivore perhaps 11 metres long, with powerful arms, large claws, and a skull designed for delivering powerful slashing bites, rather than the deep, bone-crushing bites of its later cousin Tyrannosaurus. Fossil evidence suggests that Allosaurus may have been a cooperative, or at least opportunistic pack hunter, using its jaws as a hatchet to slash at large prey animals and then waiting for them to weaken from blood loss before moving in. The Jurassic was a world of extremes. The sheer size of the animals involved makes it difficult to fully comprehend. A Brachiosaurus herd moving through a Jurassic conifer forest would have seemed, to any observer small enough to watch safely, less like a group of animals and more like a landscape rearranging itself, trees bending or snapping under their weight, the ground reverberating with each step, a sound like distant thunder, steady and rhythmic as the herd passed. But the Jurassic was also a world of innovation at smaller scales, and those smaller scale innovations would prove, in the long run, just as consequential as the evolution of the giants. In the undergrowth of those Jurassic forests, small mammals were scurrying through the leaf litter. The descendants of those battered Triassic cynodonts, fully warm-blooded now, covered in fur with complex teeth and complex brains, largely nocturnal to avoid the attention of dinosaur predators. They were small, mostly no larger than a mouse or a rat. Some were insectivores, others were omnivores. A few had developed specialized teeth for processing plant material. They were not impressive, they were not dominant. They were the perpetual underdogs of the Mesozoic, living in the cracks of a world built for and by dinosaurs, but they were mammalian, warm-blooded, with the metabolic advantages that conferred, furry with the insulative advantages that provided, smart, relatively speaking, with brains larger relative to body size than those of their reptilian contemporaries, and above all, adaptable. They would be waiting, those small furred creatures, for 150 million years, waiting through the Jurassic, through the Cretaceous, through the extraordinary diversity of the dinosaur lineages, waiting for their moment. Their moment was coming. But not yet. In the Cretaceous period, roughly 145 to 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs reached the peak of their diversity and ecological domination. The continents were now more separated than in the Jurassic, and this geographic isolation drove the evolution of distinct dinosaur faunas on different landmasses. Gondwana, the southern supercontinent, had its own characteristic dinosaur lineages. Laurasia, the northern landmass, had others. And on isolated landmasses like what would become Europe, strange dwarfed forms evolved in the ecological constraints of island living. The most famous Cretaceous dinosaurs need little introduction. Tyrannosaurus rex, the tyrant lizard king, the most recognizable prehistoric animal in human culture, lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now Western North America, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago, in the very final chapter of the dinosaur era. It was not the largest terrestrial predator that ever lived. The honour likely goes to Spinosaurus, but it may have. Had the most powerful bite of any land animal, with jaw forces estimated at some 57,000 newtons, enough to crunch through bone. Triceratops. The three-horned herbivore with its dramatic frill of bone around the back of the skull. A creature of considerable intelligence for a Cretaceous dinosaur, living in herds on the coastal plains of late Cretaceous North America, grazing on the flowering plants that had appeared during the Cretaceous and would transform the world's ecosystems, because perhaps the greatest revolution of the Cretaceous was not among the dinosaurs at all. It was the rise of the flowering plants. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, first appeared in the fossil record roughly 130 to 140 million years ago. By the end of the Cretaceous, they had spread to become the dominant plant group on Earth, displacing the conifers and ferns that had ruled before them from many of the most productive environments. The rise of flowers changed everything. Flowers are structures evolved specifically for the transfer of pollen by animals rather than wind. And the evolution of flowers drove a coevolutionary explosion in the animals that visited them. Insects, already diverse, exploded in diversity again as new groups evolved to specialize in feeding on nectar, pollen, and the fruits and seeds that angiosperms produced. Bees, butterflies, moths, beetles specialized in flower feeding, all diversified massively during the Cretaceous in close coevolution with their plant partners. Small dinosaurs fed on these insects and on the fruits and seeds. Birds, already evolved from the theropod dinosaur lineage by the early Cretaceous, diversified rapidly in this insect and fruit-rich world. And the small mammals found new resources to exploit, new niches to fill in the increasingly complex Cretaceous ecosystems. The world of the late Cretaceous was, in some ways, beginning to look almost modern. Flowering plants and insects and birds and small mammals were all present. The broad outlines of the modern terrestrial ecosystem were taking shape. All it needed was the removal of the dinosaurs from the large-body ecological niches they occupied, and the world would be ready for the mammals to inherit. That removal was coming, and it would be sudden and total, and one of the most dramatic events in the history of the planet. But let us not rush ahead. The dinosaur world deserves our quiet attention for just a little longer, because it was a world of extraordinary beauty as well as drama. Picture a late Cretaceous estuary, late afternoon, the sun lowering toward the horizon, painting the water golden and orange. Long-necked elasmosaurid plesiosaurs surface briefly, their small heads scanning the air before they sink again into the warm, shallow water. A group of hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs with crests on their heads that may have served as resonating chambers for deep, low-frequency calls, feed on the flowering plants at the water's edge, their calls carrying across the water as a sound no living human has ever heard. A pteranodon, enormous winged, its skull crest jutting back above the long toothless beak, soars overhead on thermal currents, scanning the water for fish. It has a wingspan of 7 meters, the size of a small plane, and yet its bones are hollow and its total weight is perhaps 20 kilograms. An engineering marvel in flesh and membrane. Somewhere in the undergrowth near the water, rustling a small mammal. Perhaps one of the earliest ancestors of the modern placental mammals, the group that would eventually give rise to every hoofed animal, every carnivore, every bat, every whale, every primate, and ultimately every human. It is small, furred, quick, with large eyes adapted for seeing in the low light of dusk. It is eating insects attracted to a flower. It does not know that in less than 2 million years, everything around it will be gone and the world will be its inheritance. It just eats its insects and watches for predators and lives its small, warm, busy life. And somehow that is enough. And so we come to the end of our long journey through time. We have walked from the cooling of a molten world to the stirring of the first cells. We have drifted through oceans full of invisible life, breathing the quiet revolution that made our air breathable. We have stood at the edge of Cambrian seas and watched the explosion of life into 1,000 forms. We have looked up at forests full of dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans and felt the ground shake beneath the feet of giants. We have travelled with the synapsids through their long reign and watched them survive the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. We have stood in the shadow of dinosaurs for 160 million years, small and warm and quick, waiting for our moment. We have watched the sky go dark 66 million years ago and felt the silence that followed. And then we have watched life return, tentative at first, then explosive, filling the empty world with new forms, new strategies, new possibilities. We have traced the long, patient journey of the primates, from small nocturnal insect eaters in recovering Paleogene forests to upright, fire-using, language-thinking beings on the edge of transforming the world. Every step of that journey was necessary, every extinction that cleared the path, every catastrophe that created opportunity, every quiet innovation in the chemistry of a cell, or the structure of a bone, or the circuit of a brain. All of it pointing, though it didn't know it was pointing anywhere, toward the moment you exist. You are the product of 4.5 billion years of the universe's patient work. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the least small thing there is. Tonight, let that thought be your companion as you drift towards sleep. You carry in your cells the chemistry of the first ocean. You carry in your bones minerals forged in stars long dead. You carry in your brain the slow accumulation of every adaptation that helped your ancestors survive in worlds as alien as the Carboniferous swamp and the Triassic desert and the Pleistocene steppe. You're not separate from that ancient story. You're its latest chapter. And the story goes on. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one, and now sleep well. Dream of ancient oceans filled with creatures that have no names in any human language. Dream of forests that grew and fell before the first flower ever bloomed. Dream of the long patience of evolution, working without haste or intention, but arriving, always arriving, somewhere extraordinary. Dream of the world that made you, and feel, in that dream, something like gratitude for the incomprehensible chain of events that placed you here, in this moment, in this body, in this brief and luminous life. Good night. What was your favourite chapter of this journey through Earth's deep history? Drop a comment below and let us know which ancient world you found most fascinating and where in the world you are watching from tonight.